Hi, my name is Barbara, and I work at the Gettysburg Library. And today I will be reading a story, The Brave Who Went on the Warpath Alone and Won the Name of the Lone Warrior, from Myths and Legend of the Sioux by Marie McLaughlin. There was once a young man whose parents were not overburdened with the riches of this world, and consequently could not dress their only son in as rich a costume as the other young men of the tribe. And on account of not being so richly clad as they, he was looked down upon and shunned by them. He was never invited to take part in any of their sports, nor was he ever asked to join in any of the war parties. In the village lived an old man with an only daughter. Like the other family, they were poor, but the daughter was the belle of the tribe. She was the most sought after by the young men of the village, and warriors from tribes far distant came to press their suit at winning her for their bride. All to no purpose. She had the same answer for them as she had for the young men of the village. The poor young man was also very handsome, despite his poor clothes, but having never killed an enemy nor brought home any enemy's horses, he was not, according to Indian rules, allowed to make love to any young or old woman. He tried in vain to join some of the war parties that he might get the chance to win his spurs at a warrior. To all his pleadings came the same answer: "You are not fit to join a war party. You have no horses, and if you should get killed, our tribe would be laughed at and be made fun of, as you have such poor clothes, and we don't want the enemy to know that we have any one of our tribe who dresses so poorly as you do." Again and again he tried different parties, only to be made fun of and insulted. One night he sat in the poor tepee of his parents. He was in deep study and had nothing to say. His father, noticing his melancholy mood, asked him what had happened to cause him to be so quiet, as he was always of a jolly disposition. The son answered and said, "Father, I am going on the warpath alone. In vain I have tried to be a member of one of the war parties. To all of my pleadings I have got nothing but insults in return." "But my son, you have no gun nor ammunition." "Where can you get any, and how can you get it? We have nothing to buy one for you with," said the father. "I don't need any weapons. I am going to bring back some of the enemy's horses, and I don't need a gun for that." Early the next morning, regardless of the old couple's pleadings not to go unarmed, the young man left the village and headed northwest, the direction always taken by the war parties. For 10 days he traveled without seeing any signs of camp. The evening of the 10th day, he reached a very high butte, thickly wooded at the summit. He ascended this butte, and as he sat there between two large boulders, watching the beautiful rays of the setting sun, he was suddenly startled to hear the neigh of a horse. Looking down into the beautiful valley, which was threaded by a beautiful creek, fringed with tinder, he noticed close to the base of the butte upon which he sat a large drove of horses grazing peacefully and quietly. Looking closer, he noticed at a little distance from the main drove a horse with a saddle on his back. This was the one that had neighed, as the drove had drifted further away from him. He was tied by a long lariat to a large sagebrush. "Where could the rider be?" he said to himself. As if in answer to his question, there appeared not more than 20 paces from him a middle-aged man coming up through a deep ravine. The man was evidently in search of some kind of game, as he held his gun in readiness for instant use, and kept his eyes directed at every crevice and clump of bush. So intent was he on locating the game he was trailing that he never noticed the young man who sat like a statue not 20 paces away. Slowly and cautiously the man approached, and when he had advanced to within a few paces of the young man, he stopped, and turning around, stood looking down into the valley. This was the only chance that our brave young friend had. Being unarmed, he would stand no show if the enemy ever got a glimpse of him. Slowly and noiselessly, he drew his hunting knife, which his father had given him on his departure from home, and holding it securely in his right hand, gathered himself and gave a leap which landed him upon the unsuspecting enemy's shoulders. The force with which he landed on the enemy caused him, the enemy, to lose his hold on his gun, and it went rattling down into the chasm, 40 feet below. Down they came together, the young man on top. No sooner had they struck the ground than the enemy had out his knife, and then commenced a hand-to-hand duel. The enemy, having more experience, was getting the best of our young friend. Already our young friend had 2 ugly cuts, one across his chest and the other through his forearm. He was becoming weak from loss of blood and could not stand the killing pace much longer. Summoning all his strength for one more trial to overcome his antagonist, he rushed him towards the chasm, and in his hurry to get away from this fierce attack, the enemy stepped back 1 step too far, and down they both went into the chasm. Interlocked in each other's arms, the young man drove his knife into the enemy's side, and when they struck the bottom, the enemy relaxed his hold and straightened out, stiff and dead. Securing his scalp and gun, the young man proceeded down to where the horse was tied to the sagebush, and then gathering the drove of horses, proceeded on his return to his own village. Being wounded severely, he had to ride very slowly. All the long hours of the night, he drove the horses towards his home village. In the meantime, those at the enemy's camp wondered at the long absence of the herder who was watching their drove of horses. And finally, 7 young men went to search for the missing herder. All night long, they searched the hillsides for the horses and the herder, and when it had grown light enough in the morning, they saw by the ground where there had been a fierce struggle. Following the tracks in the sand and leaves, they came to the chasm where the combatants had fallen over, and there, lying on his back, staring up at them in death, was their herder. They hastened to the camp and told what they had found. Immediately the warriors mounted their war ponies. These ponies are never turned loose, but kept tied close to the teepee of the owner. And striking the trail of the herd driven off by our young friend, they urged forth their ponies and were soon far from their camp on the trail of our young friend. All day long they traveled on his trail, and just as the sun was sinking, they caught sight of him driving the drove ahead over a high hill. Again they urged forth their tired ponies. The young man, looking back along the trail, saw some dark objects coming along, and catching a fresh horse, drove the rest ahead at a great pace. Again, all night he drove them, and when daylight came, he looked back from a high butte over his trail and saw, coming over a distant rise, 2 horsemen. These 2 undoubtedly rode the best ponies, as he saw nothing of the others. Driving the horses into a thick belt of timber, he concealed himself close to the trail made by the drove of horses and lay in ambush for the 2 daring horsemen who had followed him so far. Finally, they appeared on the butte from where he had looked back and saw them following him. For a long time they sat there, scouring the country before them in hopes that they might see some sign of their stolen horses. Nothing could they see. Had they but known, their horses were only a few hundred yards from them, but the thick timber securely hid them from view. Finally, one of them arose and pointed to the timber. Then, leaving his horse in charge of his friend, he descended the butte and followed the trail of the drove to where they had entered the timber. Little did he think that he was standing on the brink of eternity. The young man, hiding not more than 100 yards from him, could have shot him there where he stood, but wanting to play fair, he stepped into the sight. When he did, the enemy took quick aim and fired, but he was too hasty. Had he taken more careful aim, he might have killed our young friend, but his bullet whizzed harmlessly over the young man's head and buried itself in a tree. The young man took good aim and fired. The enemy threw up both hands and fell forward on his face. The other one on the hill, seeing his friend killed, hastily mounted his horse, and leading his friend's horse, made rapidly off down the butte in the direction from whence he had come. Waiting for some time to be sure the one who was alive did not come up and take a shot at him, he finally advanced upon the fallen enemy, and securing his gun, ammunition, and scalp, went to his horse and drove the herd on through the woods, and crossing a long flat prairie, ascended a long chain of hills, and sat looking back along his trail in search of any of the enemy who might continue to follow him. Thus he sat until the long shadows of the hills reminded him that it would soon be sunset. And as he must get some sleep, he wanted to find some creek bend where he could drive the bunch of ponies and feel safe as to their not straying off during the night. He found a good place for the herd, and catching a fresh horse, picketed him close to where he was going to sleep, and wrapping himself in his blanket, was soon fast asleep. So tired and sleepy was he that a heavy rain which had come up during the night soaked him through and through, but he never awakened until the sun was high in the east. He awoke, and going to the place where he had left the herd, he was glad to find them all there. He mounted his horse and started his herd homeward again. For 2 days he drove them, and on the evening of the second day he came in sight of the village. The older warriors, hearing of the young man going on this trip alone and unarmed, told the parents to go in mourning for their son, as he would never come back alive. When the people of the village saw this large drove of horses advancing towards them, they at first thought it was a war party of the enemy, and so the headmen called the young warriors together and fully prepared for a great battle. They advanced upon the supposed enemy. When they got close enough to discern a lone horseman driving this large herd, they surrounded the horses and the lone warrior and brought him triumphantly into camp. On arriving in the camp or village, the horses were counted, and the number counted up to 110 head. The chief and his criers or heralds announced through the whole village that there would be a great war dance given in honor of the lone warrior. The whole village turned out and had a great war dance that was kept up 3 days and 3 nights. The 2 scalps which the young man had taken were tied to a pole, which was placed in the center of the dance circle. At this dance, the lone warrior gave to each poor family 5 head of horses. Being considered eligible now to pay his respects to any girl who took his fancy, he at once went to the camp of the beautiful girl of the tribe, and as he was always her choice, she at once consented to marry him. The news spread through the village that lone warrior had won the belle of the nation for his bride, and this with the great feat which he had accomplished alone in killing 2 enemies and bringing home a great herd of horses, raised him to the rank of chief, which he faithfully filled to the end of his days. And many times he had to tell his grandchildren the story of how he got the name of the lone warrior.